In the saxophone family, the way you play a note that looks like a C on an alto saxophone is the same way that you play the note that looks like a C on tenor saxophone. It's the same way that you play a note that looks like a C on baritone saxophone. But in terms of how all three of those notes sound, they all three sound like different notes. I hope you guys are all doing great. For this week, we're going to be doing a little bit of a departure from what we've been doing so far this term. We're going to be working on score reading, and specifically playing reading scores of instruments that are transposing. So I want to talk a little bit about what transposing instruments means, how we figure out what they transpose to, and then go through these exercises. And in some ways, this will be a more straightforward type of exercise. I don't expect us all to be super fluent in score reading, sight reading type stuff by the end of this week. But this is just kind of to introduce us to the concept of it, and working through a few of these score reading exercises. And then, that way you'll know how to do it. And then over time, if it's something that you come across, and you likely will as a professional musician, then you'll be able to know how to approach the score reading. Even if, certainly if you are a conductor, you'll need to know how to read scores, but also oftentimes music directing, or in band situations. It's just very, very helpful for arrangers. So I want to go through kind of the main transposing instruments and how we figure out how they transpose. And some of it, by the way, I should say, there are aspects of this that you just have to know about a specific instrument. And so in this particular instance, Google can really be your friend. You can go, and if you type in an instrument, it will tell you what the transposition is for that instrument. And it'll also tell you things like the range. And you can even, if you were to look at, let's say, like an orchestration book, it can even tell you details about the specifics of the range of the instrument, how it sounds in certain registers and things like that. But we're going to do some of the kind of general information that you want to know. So we group instruments as far as transposition goes by what note we hear when they play what is written as a C. And that's a little counterintuitive. It's in some ways maybe backwards of what we might think. And there's a few reasons, by the way, that instruments transpose. One is to avoid ledger lines. For instance, like the piccolo sounds an octave higher than written. It's because if they wrote the piccolo where it was written, they would read nothing but ledger lines. If they wrote it where it sounds, they would read nothing but ledger lines. So that's one reason that instruments transpose. Another is sometimes convention. Of like historic convention. So some of it has to do with like with French horns. It has to do with a long time ago they were all in. They had different key horns for every song, and so horn and F is what ended up sticking. I think it sounded the best, but so that's one reason. Sometimes it's an aspect of history. Sometimes it's instruments in the same family, so that they can have the same fingering even when they're in different keys. So for instance, in the saxophone family, the way you play a note that looks like a C on an alto saxophone is the same way that you play the note that looks like a C on tenor saxophone. It's the same way that you play a note that looks like a C on baritone saxophone. But in terms of how all three of those notes sound, they all three sound like different notes. Those are some of the reasons that instruments transpose. We also have different clefs too. I'll try and mention some of those specifics. So anyway, the way we group the instruments is by what note we hear when they play their written C. So the first group of instruments is the C instruments or concert instruments. And when they see a note that looks like C, the note we hear is also C. Now, sometimes they might transpose by an octave, either up or down. So for instance, let me first go through them. So some of the standard, the most common C instruments are piano, guitar, harp, and then our string instruments, violin, viola, cello, bass, and then, flute, piccolo, oboe, bassoon, trombone, tuba. Voice is written as a C instrument. Now, some of these are in different clefs. For instance, the cello is in bass clef. Viola is in alto clef generally. And some of them transpose. So as I mentioned before, like piccolo sounds an octave higher than written. So if it reads a note that looks like this C, it sounds like this C. Or also there's a number of instruments that transpose down an octave. So for instance, bass sounds an octave lower than written. So when we see a note that looks like this on bass, the note that we actually hear is, and that's true of guitar as well. Guitar sounds an octave lower than written. But basically there's not much transposing with C instruments. It's either up an octave or down an octave or where it's written. The next group of instruments is B-flat instruments. So when they see a note that looks like C, the note that we actually hear is B-flat. So it looks like C in their part, but it actually sounds B-flat, right? So their music is written a whole step higher than it sounds. So some B-flat instruments, trumpet, flugelhorn, clarinet, and when someone just says clarinet, that's what they're referring to, a B-flat clarinet. There are other clarinets that are not B-flat clarinets, but if someone just says clarinet, they mean B-flat clarinet. Soprano saxophone, bass clarinet, and tenor saxophone. A few things to note, bass clarinet and tenor saxophone both sound one octave lower than written. Trumpet, flugelhorn, clarinet, soprano saxophone, they sound a major second lower than written. Bass clarinet and tenor saxophone sound a major ninth lower than written, right? And an octave plus a major second is a major ninth. So when a tenor saxophone sees their C, it sounds like this B flat, right? So it's a major ninth. The next group of instruments that we especially see a lot in the jazz world is E-flat instruments. Now so that means when they see their C, it sounds like an E flat. So what I just played is what an E flat clarinet sounds like. So it's a high sounding clarinet. So it actually sounds a minor third higher than written. So when it sees a C, the note we actually hear is E flat. Alto saxophone is, instead of being up a minor third, it is down a major sixth. So when it sees this C, what it actually sounds like is this E flat. Baritone saxophone is just like the alto saxophone, except it's one octave lower than that. So when it sees its C, it sounds like E flat. Now, one thing that's really useful to notice about E flat instruments, particularly bari sax, is that its notes fall on the same line in its written pitch. They fall on the same line or space as it sounds concert bass clef. So, for instance, C, its written C in treble clef, is on the third space of the staff. It sounds an E flat, which is on the third. It sounds an E flat concert, which is on the third space of the bass clef staff. So that can come in really handy if you are comfortable with bass clef. Then when you look at a baritone saxophone part, you can just think of it as being in bass clef, and you add 3 flats to the key signature. And there will be a few like kind of tricky moments, but it can be really useful in terms of how you think about where the register is. And then similarly, once you realize that, then when something's written for alto saxophone, then you can think of it as bass clef, just an octave higher. Anyway, that's a little trick. Okay, those are the most common for us in the jazz world. Those are most of the instruments that we tend to deal with. But a few others that are worth mentioning, our French horns, our horns, are in F, and they sound a perfect fifth lower than written. So when they see a C, it sounds like an F. Similarly, it's the same transposition for English horn. It sees a C, and what comes out is an F. So they are F instruments. And then the last one, there's not a lot of G instruments, but the one that does come to mind and is worth knowing, it is alto flute. When it sees a C, it sounds a perfect fourth lower to a G. So it's anyway, that's, you probably won't deal with that very much unless you're dealing with alto flute, but good to know. Okay, so that is my best explanation of transposing instruments. And I know it can be a little confusing, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Anyway, please feel free to send me an email and ask any questions. I'm going to now get to our exercises that you'll be playing for this week. All right.